Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a truly chilling piece of history. We're going to break down exactly how systemic instability, deep economic despair, and carefully crafted inflammatory rhetoric can completely dismantle a functioning democracy. We're unpacking the mechanics of how Adolf Hitler went from an obscure failed artist in Vienna to the absolute dictator of Germany. It's a fascinating, if really dark, look at just how fragile political systems can actually be. And that brings us to the core question, right? How does a democracy legally collapse from within? What we're looking at today is essentially a step-by-step masterclass in exploiting institutional blind spots. Honestly, the most shocking part of this whole historical event is how a republic was erased primarily from the inside, using its own rules without initially firing a single shot at the government itself. Part 1. A fractured foundation. To really understand how this collapse happened, we have to look at the massive, compounding pressures facing Germany right after the First World War. The nation was totally fractured by the crushing financial reparations demanded by the Treaty of Versailles. When you combine the sheer volatility of the newly formed Weimar Republic with this intense atmosphere of national humiliation and crippling hyperinflation, citizens literally needed wheelbarrows full of cash just to buy a single loaf of bread, you end up creating a massive vacuum of deep economic and social despair. The foundation of the nation wasn't just cracked, it was completely crumbling. Now, into this highly vulnerable vacuum stepped a frustrated yet undeniably charismatic orator. Look, when people are suffering under the weight of utter economic ruin and national shame, they're going to look for a lifeline. So transitioning from an obscure failed artist in Vienna to a mesmerizing political figure, he promised exactly what this fractured nation was so desperate to hear: the restoration of German pride and the return of economic sovereignty. Part 2. The Ideological Blueprint. Initially, his rise within the fringe National Socialist German Workers' Party was driven by an instinct for brute force. He actually attempted an armed insurrection during the 1923 Beer Hall Putsch to try and seize power. Well, it failed, and it landed him straight in prison. But behind bars, he realized something crucial. Violent, outside uprisings just weren't going to work. So he made a massive strategic pivot. He decided he would leverage the democratic system itself. Upon his release, he completely shifted his strategy with the explicit goal of manipulating the republic's own rules to destroy it from the inside out. The truly chilling reality here is that his horrific intentions were never a secret. They were publicized well in advance. While he was in prison, he penned his manifesto, Mein Kampf. And this wasn't just some book. It was a twisted, detailed ideological blueprint. It laid out core concepts like Lebensraum, or living space, which demanded aggressive expansion. And right alongside this were extreme doctrines of racial purity and intense anti-Semitism. The entire terrifying framework for his future actions was already drafted, just sitting there, waiting for the right moment to be executed. Part 3. Exploiting the crisis. But having a blueprint isn't quite enough on its own. He needed a monumental, society-shaking crisis to drag his movement from the extreme fringe right into the mainstream. And the onset of the Great Depression provided exactly that catalyst. As the Depression hit, unemployment skyrocketed all across the country. This absolute economic devastation completely shattered the public's remaining faith in the traditional democratic parties. So in the midst of all this chaos, in 1933, a really desperate political establishment, which included conservative elites, foolishly believed they could control him and harness his popularity for their own ends. So they officially appointed him Chancellor. But you have to ask, how did he get so popular that the establishment felt forced to appoint him in the first place? Well, he orchestrated it through a highly calculated, incredibly aggressive mix of tactics. He painted himself as the absolute only alternative to the perceived threat of communism and the chaos of the parliamentary system. He utilized incredibly sophisticated, highly orchestrated propaganda to spread his message everywhere. At the same time, he deployed paramilitary forces, like the SA, to physically intimidate and silence any political opponents. And through it all, he maintained this relentless, blinding focus on a false promise of national unity. It was essentially a perfectly executed pincer movement on the public consciousness. Part 4. Erasing the democracy. Once he was actually in power, the dismantling of the democracy happened at absolute breakneck speed. First off, he used the aftermath of the Reichstag fire as a convenient pretense to legally suspend civil liberties practically overnight. Next came the Enabling Act. This was a piece of legislation that entirely stripped the legislature of its power, which allowed him to just bypass parliament and pass laws by decree. Rapidly, he purged any potential political rivals and aligned both the military and the state bureaucracy strictly under his own control. He methodically dismantled every single remaining institutional check and balance one by one. By erasing the power of the parliament and completely dismantling the democratic process, he effectively transitioned Germany into a totalitarian police state. All authority in the entire nation was now legally centralized into one single person, himself, as the Führer. The system had been completely rewired from the inside out to serve his absolute command. Within just a few short years, a broken, highly vulnerable system allowed an extremist to legally maneuver his way into absolute power. The fragile democracy of the Weimar era wasn't conquered by an invading army, right? It was completely erased from within, replaced by a regime defined by terror, aggressive expansionism, and the orchestrated dehumanization of millions. And, as we know from history, this ultimately plunged the entire world into a cataclysmic war. So this leaves us with a deeply provocative question to think about. If a democratic system's own rules can be expertly leveraged to completely dismantle it from the inside, how secure are the institutional checks and balances of any fragile republic today? It's a pretty stark reminder of the fragility of the systems we often just assume are permanent, and a really powerful reason why understanding the mechanics of our history is so incredibly vital. Thanks for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep analyzing, and we'll see you next time.